From a combat sports company whose rise to prominence was centered around being known for the best fighting the best, it now seems like Dana White privilege, which I'm going to get into detail later, has taken over. Fighters like Dricus du Plessis, Magomed Ankalaev and Arnold Allen have fought hard to claw their way up the UFC rankings with impressive win streaks, only for their ranking to mean nothing when a more popular fighter dawns the Dana White privilege to find themselves as the pay-per-view attraction and, in turn, receive what many argue are undeserved title shots. It's almost as if the UFC is becoming an unscripted WWE, with the popular guys getting the push for a higher ticket gate, which is very apparent as Dana White opens every press conference with a mention of ticket sales and pay-per-view buys. All while never failing to take a jab at his foes from the boxing fraternity, with discussions of the actual fights and fighters only coming after the CEO has mentioned his bottom line. Fans are starting to notice, and they don't like it. They feel like they're being exploited by the UFC. I said earlier that the UFC is becoming like an unscripted WWE, so let me explain that. Everyone knows what WWE is. It is a product for consumption. There are storylines and characters, all written by WWE's creative department. To release the tension and anticipation built up by those storylines, a wrestling match takes place. The fighting is semi-real, the outcome is predetermined, but nobody complains because we know what it is, and everyone is happy. Now, with the UFC, the difference here is that the creative doesn't write storylines for the fighters. Everything is realistic, there are no predetermined outcomes, and the fighting is 100% real.
None of you
A match between two technically good fighters sell, but it'd sell more if there was perceived animosity between the combatants. That's why great talkers like Conor McGregor did so well in the UFC, because he told such a good story and could create real or perceived animosity between himself and his fellow fighter. So what happens if the most skilled fighter isn't the most popular? Well, ticket sales and pay-per-view buys will decline and revenue will fluctuate. The company can't afford that. This is where Dana White's privilege comes in. There are many fighters who have fallen short due to Dana White privilege. However, for this discussion, I will discuss a few of the latest victims and beneficiaries of the Dana White privilege. Dricus du Plessis had 220,000 followers on Instagram, whereas Khamzat Chimaev has 7 million followers. This has a significant influence on how many pay-per-views are bought. As a result, the UFC is more likely to make main event fights between popular fighters, even if they are not the most skilled and are still unproven at the highest level. Du Plessis had a 7-fight win streak before his fight with middleweight gatekeeper Robert Whittaker, which included victories over notable opponents such as Darren Till, Derek Brunson and Brad Tavares. Despite criticisms over his fighting style, he became pretty much impossible to ignore. After the UFC's most recent pay-per-view, Dana White confirmed that Khamzat Chimaev has earned the right to fight for the UFC middleweight title, much to the bemusement of many UFC supporters, given the somewhat controversial circumstances under which he was granted this fight. To understand this, let's go back to UFC 294, where the much adored Chimaev was returned after a year on the sidelines to fight Kamaru Usman, who was not only given 10 days notice for the fight, but was also a former champion, fresh off back-to-back losses in a smaller weight class.
As a dejected...
There it is. Oh my God.
Undisputed welterweight champ. The belt headed to the UK.
We were writing his obituary.
To the now welterweight champion Leon Edwards, who he himself will soon have to defend his title to another beneficiary of Dana White privilege. So one must ask themselves, how does a fight between an unranked fighter and a twice-defeated former champion amount to a title shot? Well, only Dana and the UFC scriptwriters know. But this is short-term thinking for a quick cash grab. Just take a look at the comment sections of videos reacting to the decision. The fans feel cheated. The UFC markets itself as the best of the best, but in reality, it's often the most popular fighters fighting each other, with the UFC somehow orchestrating a title into the mix. Dana White seems to dodge all questions related to Dricus, and fans are upset about that fight. Even current middleweight champion Sean Strickland said, The only thing I like about Chimaev is that he sells fights. For some reason, people like him or don't like him, I don't know. To me, he's a paycheck. He sells a lot of fights, people paying to watch, but he hasn't earned it, doesn't deserve it, but here we are. He doesn't deserve it, and getting a decision with a welterweight off a couch is not earning it. The UFC had to ultimately U-turn their decision to give Hamza the title shot because he suffered a torn ligament in his fight with Usman, a situation that has now reopened the door for the number 2 ranked Du Plessis to finally get a shot at the title. Dana White's favoritism has been around for a long time. Brock Lesnar is a prime example. Despite having only one professional fight, the former pro wrestler was given a co-main event spot at UFC 81 against heavyweight legend Frank Mir. Even though Lesnar lost, he was back in a title fight just one win later. Paddy the Baddie Pimblett, bringing an already vocal fan base from his time as a champion and star for the UK-based Cage Warriors promotion, is another fighter who's been accused of receiving special treatment from Dana White. Pimblett's favourable treatment includes receiving high-profile fights and opportunities, such as co-main event slot against Jared Gordon at UFC 282 after only 3 fights in the UFC. After 3 rounds, the consensus was that Gordon should have had his hand raised, so when the judges' scorecards were read in favour of Pimblett, people were stunned, with Jared Gordon saying he was robbed after the fight.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit suspicious.
But what if someone deserves the Dana White privilege? Conor McGregor helped take the UFC to the next level. He's become the organisation's top pay-per-view draw, generating record-breaking sales with his electric personality and pre-fight antics. McGregor headlined events such as UFC 202, 205 and 229, which shattered previous sales records. McGregor's charisma and knack for self-promotion propelled him, and by extension the UFC, into the mainstream.
This is so good. Of course, they think I'm toast, Ariel, but I'm still the bread.
His presence attracted new fans who might not have otherwise been interested in MMA. Oh, and by the way, if you're enjoying the video, make sure you subscribe. McGregor's blockbuster fights generated significant financial growth for the UFC. His ability to sell tickets and merchandise, as well as attract sponsorships, helped to increase the UFC's overall revenue. This was especially beneficial for the UFC because McGregor was winning. He became the first UFC fighter to hold 2 championships simultaneously in 2016, winning the featherweight and lightweight titles. McGregor began to lose UFC fights in 2016, starting with a second-round submission loss to Nate Diaz at UFC 196. McGregor's next loss came to Khabib Nurmagomedov in 2018 at UFC 229, again via submission in the 4th round. He then lost twice to Dustin Poirier, suffering a second-round TKO loss at UFC 257 and a doctor stoppage due to a broken leg at UFC 264 in 2021. This prompted an extended absence from the athlete, with many wondering if he would ever discover the heights in the sport that saw him become the first ever to unify 2 weight classes under one champion. With the forced absence from the ring of the Notorious One, Dana now faced a dilemma, as he knew that he needed a new popular and charismatic superstar to catapult and carry the brand. He needed the next Conor McGregor. Up steps Israel, the last style bender, Adesanya, a good-looking fighter with a sense of style, a sharp tongue, and even sharper reflexes. His unique and flashy kickboxing style, which draws motivation from traditional martial arts and even fictional anime characters, would often leave spectators in disbelief at just how effortlessly and eloquently he would dispatch of his opponents. Now, I'm not saying that Adesanya is an average fighter, he's one of the legends of the sport. However, much like McGregor, for Adesanya to remain the cash cow for the UFC, he would have to remain at the top, which led to the fighter at times being gifted opponents who had short notice, such as giving Sean Strickland 4 weeks notice for the fight, which ultimately backfired when he won the title. Another fighter whose rise to the top has come under question is Sugar Sean O'Malley. Hailing from Helena, Montana, US, with both American and Irish roots, the fighter did not shy away from his appreciation of style and flash.
Up the middle. That left hand hurt him bad. He's doing it again.
And again, the hesitation. He gets another highlight for the real.
In a social media era that dominated by TikTok and short videos, his fashion sense, coupled with his highlights of devastating and entertaining knockouts, would often find their way onto these platforms, which would see him appeal to an audience of consumers untapped by the UFC. The combination of skill and swagger would see the Helena native fast-tracked into title contention. After fighting just 2 top-rated bantamweights, Sugar was in line for a title shot. The then champion Aljamain Sterling would question the decision to grant him a shot and would even suggest that Dana White privilege was once again at play, with True Merit having to take a backseat. Sterling had just headlined and won UFC 288. However, he was immediately instructed to begin preparing for a showdown with O'Malley at UFC 292 just 3.5 months later. Sterling would push back at this request, stating that it requires more time to rest and recover, especially since he'd already fought 3 times in the preceding 13 months. He even gave an alternative date for the bout to take place. However, Dana ignored the request of his champion in favour of the up-and-coming O'Malley, with the CEO even going on record to tell the champion, "If you're not healthy, don't take the fight. We'll have somebody else fight. We'll do somebody else for the interim title." So, there you have it. O'Malley was going to have his title shot regardless. Leon Edwards was also very vocal about Colby Covington getting a title shot, because he thought that Covington was at least 1 win away from another shot at the UFC welterweight title.
I don't know how that makes sense, you know. Yeah, the fought for over 1.5 years, sat out, not injured. I just don't get how he just slides in for the world title shot.
He has a point, because Covington last fought at UFC 272 on March 5th, 2022, almost 2 years ago. Covington's outspoken and controversial persona has made him a polarizing figure in the UFC. Some fans appreciate his willingness to speak his mind and his ability to generate buzz for his fights. He is the perfect recipient of Dana White privilege. Despite Edwards' protests, Covington is scheduled to fight Leon Edwards for the UFC welterweight title at UFC 296 on December 16th, 2023. The UFC recognized the financial success of the Conor McGregor approach, but such a strategy requires a compliant fighter. For the first time in their history, they encountered a superstar in Francis Ngannou, who is intent on changing the status quo and overcoming Dana White privilege. With the heavyweight superstar stating in a podcast with True Geordie that Dana wanted his boy Cyril Gane to win, in reference to their heavyweight showdown at UFC 270. This begs the question, what happens if someone overcomes the Dana White privilege and becomes undeniable? Before the UFC's Reebok deal in 2015, fighters could wear their own sponsors' logos and other advertisements on their clothing and gear, both during fight week and during the fight itself. After the deal, fighters were required to wear UFC-branded uniforms, which only featured the UFC logo and the fighter's name and country of origin. Now, during this time, Ngannou was rising up the UFC ranks, winning 12 of his 14 fights and claiming the heavyweight title from Stipe Miocic in 2021. He felt that his brand had surpassed to the UFC's. However, the UFC wanted to exploit Ngannou's popularity without allowing him to profit from his own name. In a 2023 interview with Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour, Ngannou revealed that the UFC had blocked several potential sponsors from approaching him. Ngannou said that the UFC had threatened potential sponsors with being banned from the UFC if they sponsored him. He also said that the UFC had tried to pressure him to sign with sponsors that the company preferred. Francis Ngannou left the UFC after a dispute over the terms of his contract. The key factors in his decision included his desire for personal freedom over financial gain, as well as his unmet demands for health insurance for UFC fighters, the freedom to pursue individual sponsorships, a 3-fight contract, and the removal of extension clauses. Ngannou also criticized the preferential treatment that he believes the UFC gives to some fighters, referring to it also as Dana White privilege. He was stripped of his heavyweight title on January 14th, 2023, after leaving the UFC. This was the first time that a fighter of Ngannou's caliber and standing had ever taken on the UFC publicly. The UFC seemed poised to have the last laugh, well, at least for a few months. But Francis Ngannou was able to secure a $10 million fight against Tyson Fury in Saudi Arabia. Wow, getting some of that Saudi money, man. This was a significant increase from the $600,000 he earned for defeating Cyril Gane to retain the UFC heavyweight title. Ngannou was justified in leaving the UFC, especially since he only lost to Tyson Fury by split decision. Many people still debate the outcome of that fight, but regardless, Ngannou is now in high demand. He could even fight Deontay Wilder. And now, considering he never lost his title, Dana White can't necessarily claim that the UFC has the baddest man on the planet. The Ngannou saga damaged the UFC's momentum and exposed the company's greed. It also raised doubts about whether the UFC has the best talent. This is a major problem for a company that markets itself as the premier MMA promotion. The world could see that Francis was the best, but the UFC did everything it could to drive him out.
Get the hell out of here!
And despite being marketable and a good fighter, he didn't check the final box to receive Dana White privilege. And that's compliance. Demetrius Johnson's success outside the UFC serves as proof that the UFC does not have a monopoly on talent. In 2012, Johnson became the inaugural UFC flyweight champion and defended his title a record-breaking 11 times. However, he was subsequently traded to one championship.
Malky sort of like, hey, let's do a trade, right? Like, we'll give you Ben Askren for Demetrius Johnson.
Raising the question, does the UFC really have the best of the best? And why did Demetrius not get the Dana White privilege despite him being the best in his weight class? Maybe not being as promotable as other fighters has something to do with it. What do you think? Is Dana White privilege real? Leave a comment down below and consider subscribing.